All right. My goal today was to get through Daniel and Ezekiel, but in the last class I managed only to get through Daniel with like 5 minutes to spare, so probably we're only doing Daniel today. But we've been through the history of the divided kingdom, right? We've looked at the history of the northern kingdom down through its destruction by Assyria, and then we looked at the history of the southern kingdom down through its altercation with Assyria under Hezekiah, and Assyria being turned back and defeated, and then the Babylonians taking over for the Assyrians after the Assyrians are weakened. And then later, the Babylonians come back and take over the southern kingdom and carry the people into exile, carry people off into various parts of the Babylonian Empire. And so that's the history of the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, that divided kingdom era. And so now we're coming into the exile period. And this is after both of the kingdoms have been wiped out. It starts at the very end of the divided kingdom period and goes through until the exiles are allowed to return, until one of the Persian kings permits the return of the people of God to Jerusalem. And in this period, we have two books that are pretty significant and loaded to it. We have Daniel and Ezekiel. There's also Esther, that is stories of the people of Israel in exile, but that Esther seems to be from the period after the exiles were allowed to return, and it's about Jewish people that decided not to return and have stayed in the countries where they were taken off. And so it's exiles who chose not to return to Jerusalem. So this period of the exile, our two main books, or the two main books that we're going to get stories from this era, are Daniel and Ezekiel. And both Daniel and Ezekiel are part of the exiles that were taken from Judah in the first Babylonian deportation under King Jehoiakim. And don't get Jehoiakim confused with Jehoiakim or Jehoiachin. Jehoiakim is the K-I-M at the end. He is attacked by Babylon, and the Babylonians carry off a wave of deportees and a wave of exiles. But then under the next king, Jehoiachin, the kingdom is kind of officially disbanded, and the Babylonians carry off a huge additional wave of exiles, almost everybody else, and then appoint a governor, Zedekiah, to rule over Judah until he rebels again, and they kill him and carry him off into carry the rest of the people off into captivity then. And so we end up with like three different waves of deportation from Judah by Babylon. And Daniel and Ezekiel are both carried off during that first wave. Ezekiel is a young man in training for priesthood when he's carried off into captivity, and the first vision that he receives, his kind of first role as prophet, comes during his 30th year, when he would have actually been installed as a priest and would have begun serving as a priest. So priests were trained up until age 30 and then actually began functioning as priests at 30. And so in the year that Ezekiel would have become a priest formally, would have actually started serving as a priest, instead he is in captivity and is given these visions and begins to serve as a prophet. Daniel and these other three guys, Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah, are all young Jewish men that are carried off into captivity in that first wave of deportation by Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. And they are carried to the capital city and are trained to enter into the king's service. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And so all of these guys are part of that first wave of deportation carried off into Babylon, into exile. And if you look at Daniel and Ezekiel together, you'll probably see there's this kind of common theme or things that we have not seen a whole lot of before this point. Up to this point, we've seen we've had lots of prophets, and we've read a lot of the narratives or the stories of the prophets, and then the prophecies that they record. And for the most part, there are some kind of sign acts or some things that God tells the prophets to do that are kind of weird and symbolic, like Hosea marrying the prostitute and so on. And so God tells them to do some things that are supposed to kind of enact the relationship between God and Israel, or what is going to happen to Israel or Judah as a result. But they haven't seen a whole lot of we haven't seen just a whole lot of really weird pictures and weird dreams and visions. But that's going to change here, because in Daniel and Ezekiel, we're going to get some really weird and strange stuff. Like, we're going to see visions of statues made of different kinds of metal, and each one having a kind of symbolic meaning. And we're going to see visions of great beasts with really weird amalgamations of parts, and visions of angels carrying a vault chariot thing with God's throne seated on it. And these angels are going to be described as 4 living creatures that have wings and are strange. And so we're going to get all this really strange imagery that sometimes people associate with the prophets in general. And really, it's not the prophets as a whole. It's not the whole prophetic group. It's this specific subgroup called apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature is full of all of these really weird pictures and really strange visions that then have a meaning, and these things are, all of the really weird elements in the vision or dream are symbolic of something. And so this Daniel and Ezekiel are kind of the primary apocalyptic literature. There's moments of apocalyptic literature in some other prophets, but primarily it's Daniel and Ezekiel that are the apocalyptic literature of the Old Testament. And then when you come to the last book of the Bible, to Revelation, you get another apocalyptic literature. And you'll notice after you read Daniel and Ezekiel, if you then go and read Revelation, you'll find that there's a whole lot of shared imagery between the three. That in fact, Revelation is using a lot of pictures from Daniel and Ezekiel. And so if you want a kind of a hint at what Revelation is all about and how you should understand and interpret Revelation, you should go back and read Daniel and Ezekiel and see what the interpretation of the visions were in those 2 books. And then remember also that this whole style of literature arises from these 2 books that are written during this period of exile. And so they're written to a people who are in exile. But this is not New Testament, and so we're not going to go and try to interpret Revelation. It's just know that there's a very deep connection between Revelation, which is one of the most mysterious books in the Bible, and certainly in the New Testament. There's a very deep connection between that and Daniel and Ezekiel and this apocalyptic literature. And so that's what we're dealing with. We're in the period of the exile. We're getting this new kind of literature, apocalyptic literature, and as part of that, we're going to see some really strange pictures that have some really unexpected interpretations. They'll kind of make sense after they're interpreted, but the pictures used to describe them and the images used to describe them are very strange. And so, focusing in now on Daniel. Daniel is, as I said, Daniel is a young man that is carried off into captivity during that first wave of deportation. And he's taken with Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah. All 4 of these young men are taken and deported. And then these 4 young men are chosen for a special program that King Nebuchadnezzar sets up. King Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree that some of the best and brightest from all of the exiled peoples or all of the captive peoples that Babylon has taken over are to be put into a special training program, and they're to be, over the course of 3 years, they're supposed to be taught literature and language and customs of the Babylonians, and given training in all of these various areas of wisdom and knowledge, like botany and animal husbandry and politics and economics and so on. All these various areas of knowledge they're supposed to be trained in. And at the end of this 3 years of training of the best and brightest from all the captive peoples, the king will choose some to enter into his service, choose the best of the best to enter into the king's service, and to be given positions in the kingdom. And Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah are all chosen for this program. They're all put into this program. And as they're put into this program, the Babylonians give each of these young men a Babylonian name in place of their Hebrew name. And so Daniel is given the name Belteshazzar, which is named after the god of one of the main gods of the Babylonians. And then Mishael is renamed to Meshach. Hananiah is renamed Shadrach. And Azariah is renamed Abednego. And honestly, you probably all are more familiar with these three guys as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego than you are as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But those are their Hebrew names, the names that they are given as children and that they live with until they are carried off into captivity. Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah are their names, and then the Babylonians renamed them in captivity to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so these four young men are carried into captivity and put into the special program and begin to receive this training. And as part of this training or part of this program, the king decrees that all of the young men in this program are to be fed from the king's table, which means they will get to eat some of the richest, finest food in the land. And there's wine on the table. There's meats of all different kinds on the table, breads. It's really really good, various food. But the problem for Daniel and the other young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is that almost all of the food on the table is unclean for them as good Jewish men, or as Hebrew young men. Much of the meat is from animals that they are forbidden to eat because it's unclean. So like shellfish and pork and so on. All these various different kinds of animals are unclean. They must not eat them. And then even the meat that is from clean animals, or from animals that would normally be able to eat the meat of, all of the meat on the king's table has been sacrificed to his idols, and so it's meat that has been prepared as part of a sacrifice and worship to these idols, and to eat the meat afterwards is to participate in that worship. And so even the clean animals are made unclean by their being sacrificed to idols. So all of the meat is off limits, and then the wine on the table also has been sacrificed or has been dedicated to the gods of Babylon, and so they can't drink the wine without being seen as participating in that worship. And so there's all this stuff on the table, but they can't eat it without defiling themselves, without breaking the law of the Hebrews. And so Daniel goes and speaks to the man that is in charge over the administrator that's been put in charge over this program, and asks for permission to not eat from the king's table, but instead to eat what he would eat, what he can eat from it, basically to eat what is clean for him. And this administrator at first tells him no, because even though the administrator is well disposed to Daniel and the other Hebrew boys, he doesn't want Daniel and these other boys becoming weak and starting to look sickly because they aren't eating a full meal, eating full diet, a good diet. Because then the king will want to know why these look sickly, and when it's found that he's given permission for them to not eat from the king's table, then the king's going to get angry with him and maybe kill him. And so he's at first he says, no, you're not going to eat other food. You're going to eat from the king's table, because otherwise the king will be angry with me and maybe kill me. And so then Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego together ask for permission to do an experiment and to take a 10-day trial. And basically for the next 10 days, they ask for permission for over the course of 10 days to eat nothing but vegetables and drink nothing but water. And so they're going to eat vegetables and drink water and not touch anything on the king's table. And at the end of 10 days, this administrator can examine them, and if they look healthy, then let them keep doing it. If not, then they will consent to eat from the king's table. And the administrator says, okay, 10 days, what's the worst that could happen? Sure, we'll try your experiment for 10 days. And so at the end of 10 days, they come back, they've eaten nothing but vegetables and water, and the administrator looks at them compared to all the other young men and says, you actually look better than they do. You actually look healthier than those who have been eating from the king's table. So yes, you may continue to eat as you see fit. And so it gives them permission, and they eat as they see fit from then on. And that's basically the contents of chapter 1 of Daniel. They get carried off into captivity. They're assigned to this special program to train up the best and the brightest. And in the midst of that, they have this moment where they have to push back against those who have carried them off into captivity and say, we can't eat this food. Can we have permission to do a trial to make sure we stay healthy? And God gives them health, and they come out the other side even healthier than the others. And then the chapter ends with these 4 young men excelling in their studies, excelling in everything that they've been assigned to do, and coming out the other side as kind of the best and the brightest of this group of the best and the brightest. And the king, Nebuchadnezzar, selects all 4 of them for positions of authority in his court. Daniel is chosen to be an advisor in the palace, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are also kind of in with that group, and they'll get further honors as we go. And so that's the end of chapter 1. And then Daniel does something strange. The book Daniel, not the guy Daniel, does something strange. The language changes. The language of composition for the book changes. And we're going to get 6 chapters that are not in Hebrew, but are in Aramaic. Aramaic is a kind of a cousin language to Hebrew. Hebrew basically was spoken by the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob, God's people in Israel and Judah. And so Hebrew is spoken in Israel and Judah, but then almost all of the nations surrounding them spoke a dialect of Aramaic, which was a related language. And so most of the other peoples in the ancient Near East spoke a version of Aramaic instead of Hebrew. And so we have the first chapter, and then the last 5 chapters, 8 through 12, are in Hebrew, but then we have these center 6 chapters, 2 through 7, are in Aramaic, this other language, this language of the nation that has carried them into exile. And so there's also a kind of a structure to this Aramaic section, chapters 2 through 7. It has the chiastic structure that we talked about way back with Leviticus, and then a couple of times since then, this pattern that is then reversed and repeated later. So this kind of mirror image pattern called chiastic structure, or chiasmus. So that's chapter 1 ends, and chapter 2 begins, and we're in another language. We're in Aramaic. And in chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And this dream disturbs him at night, and so he comes the next day and asks all of his officials and all of the wise men that he has kept gathered around him for years and years. He asks them to interpret his dream, but with a twist, he's not going to tell them what the dream is first. And so to prove that they have the wisdom to be able to interpret the dream, he wants them to tell him his dream without him giving them any clues or hints to what it is. And so he says, you tell me my dream and interpret it for me, and then I'll trust your interpretation. And these wise men kind of look at each other, and they look back at the king, and they say, nobody can do that. You have to tell us what the dream is before we can tell you what it means. We can't just guess what your dream is and then guess an interpretation for it. That's not the way this works. No king has ever asked this of his officials or his wise men before. Tell us your dream and we'll tell you what it means, but you have to tell us what the dream is. And Nebuchadnezzar kind of throws a hissy fit, temper tantrum over this, and tells them basically, if you can't tell me what my dream is and what it means, then I'm going to kill you all. And so Nebuchadnezzar gives a decree that not only the wise men that were in the court that day and failed to tell him his dream, but all the wise men of Babylon are to be put to death. And turns out Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are all in that big umbrella of the wise men of Babylon. And so they're going to be killed as well. And when the captain of the guard comes out to prepare for this mass execution, Daniel grabs him and asks what's going on, and it's explained to him. And so then Daniel goes in to speak to the king and asks basically for an opportunity to tell him what his dream is and what it means. And so then Daniel leaves and he goes to bed that night, and overnight God gives him a vision of Nebuchadnezzar's dream and its meaning. And he wakes up the next morning, he goes into the king, and the king asks, "So Daniel, can you tell me my dream and what it means?" Or Belteshazzar, actually, because that's his Babylonian name. So, "Can you tell me what my dream was and what it means?" And Daniel's reply is basically, "No, I can't. I can't tell you what your dream means, but there is a God who is a revealer of mysteries, and he has revealed what your dream is and what it means, and I can tell it to you now. So I can tell you what God has revealed to me." And so Daniel begins to tell the king what his dream is. And in this dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw this huge human statue, this huge statue of a human being, of a man. And he said that the head of the statue is of gold, and the shoulders are of silver, the chest is of bronze, the legs are of iron, and the feet and toes are of mingled iron and hardened clay. And then, after describing the statue, Daniel says, And in your dream, you saw a stone cut from the ground, but not by human hands. It was not cut by humans, but a stone cut from the ground is hurled at the feet of this great statue. And it shatters the feet, and not only the feet, but all of the rest of the statue is shattered, and its pieces are carried away by the wind like chaff, like the leftover bits of wheat, the wheat harvest. And so it's carried, the statue is shattered and its pieces carried away like chaff, and then this stone swells and grows until it becomes a great mountain. And that's what you saw in your dream, O king. And here's what it means. You, Nebuchadnezzar, you, O king, have been anointed and lifted up by God, the God of the heavens, to be ruler over all of the world. You are a king over kings, and there are, even over animals, you have the authority within your realm. You are supreme as king, and your kingdom is a great and glorious one. It's beautiful. It's amazing. You have been given great power, great wealth, great prosperity. But after you will come a kingdom that is not as great as yours, that is less splendid, is less beautiful and amazing than yours is. And then following that kingdom will come yet another kingdom that is lesser than, that is less splendid. And that would be those two succeeding kingdoms would be the shoulders of silver and the chest and torso of bronze. And then after that will come a kingdom of iron that will shatter all the other nations, that will break all the other nations like iron breaks practically everything else. And in the end, that nation will have a kind of mingled strength and brittleness, that the feet and toes of iron and of hardened clay. And God will raise up a kingdom that will come in and shatter all of the previous kingdoms, that will blow away all of the previous kingdoms, and this kingdom that God sends, that God provides, will grow and will never end. And that, O king, is your dream. And when he hears that, when Nebuchadnezzar hears the interpretation of the dream, and that Daniel was able to tell him what his dream was first, he trusts Daniel's interpretation, trusts the vision, and rewards Daniel by exalting him and making him kind of among the chief magi, the chief wise men. And then at Daniel's request, he exalts Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and makes them rulers over provinces of Babylon. And so they are raised up into administrative roles over particular regions of Babylon, while Daniel is kept in the king's palace to advise the king. And so they're all exalted, raised up, because God gives Daniel the interpretation, the dream and the interpretation from it. And so in chapter 2, we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And then in chapter 3, we have Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. And apparently, as a result of the dream and its interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar has decided to build this enormous golden statue. In fact, it's as tall as a lot of multi-story buildings. It's described as being 60 cubits high, which would be about 90 feet high, and you can get an 8, 9, 10-story building out of 90 feet. And so it's this enormously tall statue made into the shape of a man, and the whole thing is made out of gold. This is obviously, a 90-foot tall statue this big would be actually very difficult to make out of gold, because gold is too flexible and too malleable. And so it's probably not entirely made of gold. It's plated in gold, or it's covered in gold. But the intention for Nebuchadnezzar is to build this giant statue made out of gold that reflects what he saw in his dream, because Daniel tells him that he is the head of gold, but then there's all these other nations that surround him that are made, that will come after him, that are made out of various other metals. And so Nebuchadnezzar builds this gigantic statue, but makes the whole thing be gold. And the question then is, this isn't ever actually explained or described in the text, but the question is Nebuchadnezzar doing this because he's trying to change the outcome of the vision that he was given, so that there won't be any kingdoms to succeed him? It's just gold all the way down. It's Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar all the way to the floor, and so that there will be no end to Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. Again, that's not described, but what is described is that Nebuchadnezzar builds this giant statue, makes it all out of gold, and then demands that on a particular day, the day that they dedicate the statue, Everyone is to bow down and worship the statue. And when the music, he's going to have musicians there. It's going to be a big thing. When the musicians play, when they hear the music, everyone is to stop what they're doing and bow to this statue that he has built, this 90-foot tall golden statue. And so the day comes, and he also, part of the decree, part of this command that he gives that everyone is to bow down, is that anyone who refuses to bow and worship the statue is to be thrown into a hot furnace. Metalworking furnace. It's very, very hot enough to melt bronze at least, and probably iron by this point. And so that's the decree. And the day comes, the musicians play, the people bow, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being good Hebrew boys, don't bow. They refuse to bow down and worship an idol. After all, their people have been carried off into captivity because of their history with idol worship, and so they aren't willing to bow and worship the statue. And word gets back to King Nebuchadnezzar that these Hebrews are not bowing to the statue that he made, and reminding the king of the decreed punishment. And so the king calls in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and kind of basically gives them one last chance and says, it's come to my attention that you did not bow. The music is going to play again, and if you will bow and do as I said, well and good. If not, into the furnace with you. And the Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they reply and say, King, we know that our God is able to deliver us from your hands, and believe that God will deliver us from your hands if you do as you have said. But even if God does not deliver us, then know that we will not bow to your statue, we will not bow to your idol and worship it. And the king, when he hears that, he's thrown into a rage. He has a hissy fit again. And he commands that they be bound and they be tied up, and that they take the nearby furnace and stoke it to make it 7 times hotter than it usually is, to heat it up to the point that it's probably going to start melting the furnace. And so to heat it up as hot as they can get it, 7 times hotter, and throw these insolent Hebrew boys in. And the king's anger is so intense that apparently the soldiers that are tasked with this are afraid of what's going to happen, and so they, in their haste, tie the boys up and throw them in, but something happens. Either they slip, the soldiers are running so fast to get this done that they go too far themselves, or they slip, or maybe it's just the intensity of the heat with them in whatever metal armor they were wearing. Whatever happens, the soldiers involved in throwing the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace die from the heat. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are dropped into the furnace. And just a minute or two later, the king looks into the furnace, and he turns to somebody nearby and he says, "Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire?" "Yes, king, we threw 3 men bound into the fire." He says, "Then why do I see 4 men walking around unbound, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods?" I was like, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come on back out." King shouts, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out." And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come walking right out of the furnace like it was, an afternoon on the beach. And when they come out, the people notice, or people around them notice, that not only are they not singed or scorched or look like they've been burned in any way, their clothes don't even have the smell of smoke on them. It's like they were totally untouched by being inside the furnace. And when they come out, the king looks at them and says, "All right, obviously your God is the real deal. Your God is the God over all gods. And so from this day forward, he issues a decree, anyone who speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, against the God of the Hebrews, will be killed, and his house made into a pile of rubble." So basically his entire household will be smashed down, and the man will be killed, and all prosperity of his family will be taken away. If you say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you're done. And so that's the decree that the king gives after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are delivered from the fiery furnace. And that's chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, chapter 4 actually is spoken entirely from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. Seems to be written by Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nebuchadnezzar writes about his experience of having yet another dream or vision, and Daniel interpreting it for him, and then it all coming true. And so in this dream or vision, Nebuchadnezzar sees this great giant tree, and the branches of this tree are so high up, it's such a tall tree that the branches seem to reach up to heaven. and there are all kinds of birds and fruit up in the branches, and there's all kinds of other animals that are living in the shade of this tree and eating its fruit. And so all of these different animals and creatures that are dependent on this tree for life and protection. And so he sees this enormous, beautiful, tall, powerful tree. And then there is a holy one that comes down from heaven, some kind of an angelic being or figure that comes down from heaven, and this angelic figure is told to cut down the tree. And so the angel cuts down the tree, or the Holy One cuts down the tree, chops off its branches, strips its bark, and scatters its fruit all over the place. And then leaves the stump and binds the stump in iron and bronze to preserve it, and then goes on. And so Daniel is called in to interpret this dream. Nebuchadnezzar calls Daniel in to ask him, what does this dream mean? And Daniel tells the king the bad news. He says, I wish this dream was about your enemies instead of about you, but here, O king, is what the dream means. You are the great tree. You have been given power and authority. God has exalted you and given you all of this authority and power. And there are many peoples and of many kinds that are under your protection, and their lives are sustained by you, by your fruit. But you are becoming proud. And a day is going to come when God is going to humble you because of your pride, and you will be taken down, and you will become a madman, basically. You're going to lose your sanity, and you will wander around like an animal in the fields, and you will eat grass and drink dew off of leaves, and your sanity is going to be just lost. You will not be yourself until the day you recognize that your authority comes from heaven, and that heaven is in charge of the earth, not you, and that God has authority over you, until you humble yourself before God. And then God will restore you and bring you back when you acknowledge that you are under him, that your authority is below his. And that was the meaning of the stump that was bound in iron and bronze to make sure that it could regrow someday in the future. And so he has the dream, Daniel gives him the vision, and sure enough, about a year later, 12 months later, Nebuchadnezzar is walking around on the outside of his palace, up high on the walls, and he looks around at his magnificent city that he has built and the kingdom around him, and he congratulates himself for this amazing kingdom that he has built. And at the moment that he speaks, he hears a voice that tells him, basically, I told you so. And his sanity is lost, and for 7 years, he wanders and is not himself. And his kingdom is taken from him, and others have to govern over it. And he lets his fingernails and his hair grow out long, and he just looks like a wild man, and everything. I mean, he goes nuts. And then after 7 years, he comes to himself, and he recognizes God's authority, that heaven is supreme over the earth, that God is supreme over all other kings. And he humbles himself before God, and God restores his sanity. And then just after that, his officials and advisors come to him and find him and reinstate him on his throne, give him back his power and his authority, and he is restored as the king of Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar, again, recognizes God's authority, that the God of the Hebrews is great above all other gods. So Nebuchadnezzar ends up humbled in the 4th chapter, and then in chapter 5, chapter 5 happens after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, after his son Belshazzar has taken the throne. And so during Belshazzar's rule, the dream from chapter 7 is during the first year of Belshazzar's rule, but before that we're going to get two chapters to kind of look further in the future. And so during Belshazzar's reign, at the very end of Belshazzar's reign actually, he decides to throw this big party, and while he and all of his officials are in this palace getting very drunk on some good wine, he decides that he wants to do something to kind of kick up the party an extra notch, and so he sends someone into the temple treasury, or into the Babylonian treasury, to bring out artifacts from the temple in Judah, to bring the temple of God's artifacts out. And they bring the goblets from the temple in Judah and set them before the king, and the king orders that everybody be allowed to drink wine from these sacred goblets from the temple in Judah. And so he has this one very proud, arrogant moment where he wants to show how great he is, and that he's going to drink wine from the sacred goblets of Judah, of Israel. And as he is drinking, they continue on this party, and almost immediately there is this weird spectral something hand, this very obviously weird disembodied hand that appears and starts burning words into the wall in the palace. And all the party goers just kind of are frozen watching this hand carve these words into the wall. And the words are Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And the king has no idea what this means, but he's pretty freaked out by the handwriting in flames on the wall all of a sudden. And so he asks for anybody that can interpret it to come and interpret, tell him what this means, and he will reward them greatly. He'll give them all these riches and all these honors if they can interpret this. And nobody present can do it, and so Daniel is sent for, and Daniel comes in, and Daniel looks and sees the words on the wall, and hears what has happened, and he turns to the king and gives him the interpretation. He says that these words, you have become arrogant and proud, and these words written on the wall are God's way of telling you what is about to happen. The inscription written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, or just Parsin, depending on the translation, it says, here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. So Mene, Mene is written twice. He's got 2 days left. And Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Basically, you have behaved in a way that God is determined to end you. You have been weighed up, and it's been found that you are inadequate as king. And Upharsin, that your kingdom is divided and will be given to the Medes and the Persians. And sure enough, the next night, the king immediately rewards Daniel for his interpretation. And the next night, the Medes and the Persians work together. The Medo-Persians come in and attack the Babylonians, and they sack the city, and they kill the king. And so King Belshazzar is killed on this night, and the Persians take over. And so the Babylonian Empire falls to the Persians, and the first king of this new Persian Empire that we're going to deal with is King Darius. And so we have Darius the Mede, who rules over the Persian Empire. And so we have Belshazzar, in his moment of extreme arrogance, being humbled or humiliated, brought down by God. And that brings us then to chapter 6, where under the new king, Darius, Darius has decided to put all of the Persian Empire under the authority of some regional governors. And so he appoints all of these various governors all over the country, 120 of them total, 120 satraps to rule over these 120 provinces. And then to have these 120 province rulers report back to 3 counselors, including Daniel and 2 others, who will then report to the king. And so he's got this kind of stratified system where he's got 3 men under him. Each of them have 40 provinces that they oversee, and then those 120 total provincial commanders rule over all the various parts of his kingdom. And it turns out that Darius very quickly forms a favorite in that group of 3, and that's Daniel. And so then the other 2 are insanely jealous of Daniel's influence over the king and the favorite that the king shows him. And so these other 2 conspire to try to bring Daniel down, to try to remove him so that they can get the position of favored ruler, or that they can have more influence over the king. And so they start working together to try to find some kind of dirt that they can use against Daniel to discredit him, or some kind of skeleton in his closet that they can use against him. And they quickly find out that there really isn't anything that they can use. He hasn't done anything radically immoral. He doesn't steal from the king or line his own pockets. He doesn't extort. There's nothing that he's done that's actually wrong that they can point to that they can use to discredit him. But there is this one thing that he does. Every day he goes to his rooms and he opens the window towards the east and he prays towards Jerusalem. And so he prays towards Jerusalem every day, 3 times a day, prays to his God, and he does it in the full sight of everybody. And so they start cooking up a scheme to use this against him somehow. And so they come up with the idea they're going to go to the king and ask the king, flatter the king, and then ask him to appoint a day where all the peoples in the land are commanded to worship only the king, to pray to only the king for a day, to recognize how great the king is. And in the midst of all of this flattery, the king agrees. This would be a great idea. One day that's all about how awesome he is. And so he puts it into writing, signs a decree that on this date, particular day, everyone in the kingdom is to pray and bow down to no one else and to nothing else, to no other god except the king of Persia, to Darius. And anyone who violates this decree will be thrown into a den of hungry lions. And here is an important understanding with specifically the Persian system. And this is going to be a plot point for Daniel here, and then also for Esther later, and then to a lesser degree in some other places in Ezra and Nehemiah, that under the Persian law, the king could make practically any decree he wanted to. He could sign anything into law, but once a decree was made, it couldn't just be overturned. Even the king had to abide by it. And so once a thing was signed into law and the law was distributed, it could not be overturned. It had to stand. And so the king signs this decree that on a particular day at a particular time, for one day, no one is allowed to pray to anyone or anything except for King Darius, on penalty of the lion's den. And sure enough, the day comes, and Daniel does what he always does. He goes to his rooms 3 times, he throws open the door, and he prays towards Jerusalem and prays to his God. And he throws open the windows, and everybody can see him. And so, of course, these other 2 jealous advisors, come back to the king and say, "Look, O king, Daniel has violated your decree. Did you not say that anyone who prays to any god other than you on this day will be thrown into a den of lions?" And yes, I signed that law, obviously. And then look, here's Daniel, and he has prayed to his God in Jerusalem 3 times that day. And so you must throw him into the den of lions. And the king at that point, of course, realizes that he's been hoodwinked by these other 2 advisors, that they have manipulated him into getting rid of Daniel. And so the king, really liking Daniel, as he carries him to the lion's den to be thrown in, tells him, "I really hope that your God is able to protect you tonight, and that you will still be here in the morning." And so Daniel is thrown into the den of lions, and the king goes back and has a really sleepless night. Can't get to bed, nothing. He's miserable all night long. And then he comes back the next morning, and he shouts down into the lion's den, hoping that Daniel is still alive, and says, "Daniel, was your God able to protect you? Are you still alive?" And Daniel's voice comes back to him and says, "Yes, king, I am alive. God sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions and preserve me through the night. I'm fine." And so they pull Daniel up out of the lion's den, and the king turns to those other 2 advisors that had tried to conspire against Daniel and used the king to do it. And he says, "Your turn." And so he takes those 2 advisors and throws them into the lion's den, and not only them, but their families as well. And apparently the lions did not have their mouths shut and found their appetites, because none of them come back out. And so these other 2 advisors are killed by the lions in the lion's den. And that's what happens in chapter 6. And then in chapter 7, as I said, we have a dream, and this is from back during Belshazzar's reign, at the very beginning of Belshazzar's reign. But it's Daniel having this dream, and Daniel sees these 4 weird-looking beasts, these 4 strange creatures. And the creatures, the first looks like a lion and has wings of an eagle. The second, it looks like a bear and has ribs in its mouth. The third looks like a leopard, but it also has wings like a bird and has 4 heads. And then the last is terrifying and frightening, doesn't particularly look like any other beast, but it has large iron teeth and crushes and devours its victim and is different from all the former beasts, and it has 10 horns. And so we get these weird-looking creatures, but we're told then that each of them is representative of a kingdom that will come after the Babylonians. And so the 4 beasts in Daniel's dream are parallel to the other kinds of metal on the statue of the man from Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And the end result for all of these is that they will be defeated that all of these great kings, these kingdoms will be taken down, their pride and their arrogance and their violence and their injustice will be put to an end, and God's reign, God's kingdom will come and reign forever. There's also this is when the Son of Man is seen, and so you can see now this kind of the chiastic structure here. You have the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, and then at the end of the sequence, the dream of Daniel, and they're both about the kingdoms of the earth that will be coming and their end, their final destruction by God's kingdom. And then there's, in chapters 3 and 6, we have two stories of the hubris and pride of a king leading to danger for God's people and God preserving the faithful people of God through that situation. So in chapter 3, the king gives an order that everyone must bow to his statue, and in chapter 6, the king gives an order that everyone must bow to the king. But in both cases, the faithful remnant of the Hebrews in exile refuses and is punished or persecuted as a result, but God preserves them and protects them through that punishment or through that whatever the consequence. And then in the middle of this, we have two different examples of a king in the midst of their hubris and their pride being humbled by God. One is brought low and made like a crazy person and lives like an animal for a period. And then the second, the king is brought low and killed and his kingdom given to a new reign, a new empire. And so that's the Aramaic section in Daniel. And then chapters 8 through 12 are a continuation of the visions and dreams that Daniel sees, but we switch back to Hebrew for these. And so in the last chapters, we see this series of visions, and they kind of follow on a lot of the same themes that we've seen before. There are these weird images of animals with weird features and extremely long horns, and sometimes many, many, many horns. And they all represent different kings and officials and kingdoms that will come after the Babylonians. And then also in the midst of this, in chapter 9, there's one chapter that is a prayer of Daniel rather than a specific vision. And during that prayer, he is reflecting on the prophecy in Jeremiah that the exile will last for 70 years. And he is praying to God that God will show mercy and maybe shorten the period of the exile, or will at least preserve his people through that period of 70 years and bring them out on the other side. And God replies or responds to Daniel's prayer and says, your people, I have promised the 70 years of exile, but your people haven't humbled themselves. As a whole, your people have not learned their lesson. They have not humbled themselves before me. They are still corrupt. They still defile themselves and do what they should not do. And so I'm going to extend their 70 years 7 times. And so it won't be 7 years, it'll be 70 times 7 years, 490 years. And so at the end of that 70 years, God will bring his people back to Israel, but they will not be given their freedom and independence. They'll still be under the thumb of another nation, another kingdom, and that will continue to be true for hundreds of years, for 490 years. And by the time you get to the end of that 490 years, you're actually very close to the New Testament era, to come to the New Testament era. And so we get this kind of string of visions of Daniel through the end of the book that kind of all follow that same theme, but we also get this idea that the exile will not be over at the end of 70 years. Their oppression will just take another form at the end of 70 years. And that's it. We're out of time, and we'll pick up Ezekiel on Monday because you guys have Friday off, right? So you enjoy your long weekend, worship for Easter, and we'll see you back on Monday, and we'll look at Ezekiel.